Hello and welcome to Cheetah TV. My name is Brian Badger from the Cheetah Conservation Fund. In this series of videos entitled Conservation Conversations, I'm inviting along lots of different types of people from different disciplines in the conservation world from all around the globe. And today's no exception. Today I caught up with Fiesta Warinwa. Now, Fiesta is with Agile Consultants, and her speciality is in community-based conservation, specifically community-based natural resource management. Now, I worked alongside Fiesta during some training sessions and some workshops in Somaliland, where the local leaders and different politicians and all the different stakeholders in Somaliland came together to learn about this community-based conservation and also the use and the workings of conservancies. And today we'll learn a lot about conservancies, what they are and how important they are. So if you like the video, please subscribe, like, share, and don't forget to click the notification button so you don't miss future episodes of Conservation Conversations. But without further ado, let's go across and catch up with Fiesta. In this little series, we're inviting people along, primarily the guests they attended and contributed to the Global Cheetah Summit that happened in Addis Ababa in January 2024. Our special guest today contributed significantly to the summit, and her name is Fiesta Warinwa, and she works for Agile Consultants, and she specializes in community-based national resource management and also conservancies as well. So a very warm welcome to you, Fiesta, and I hope it's sunny and warm or wherever you want it to be in whatever part you're in.
Yeah.
So if I could start off by asking a little bit about you, because when I talk to people all over the world and they often ask, well, how did you get to where you are? How do you get into this? So give us a little idea about your kind of career path and leading up to what you're doing now and what your responsibilities are now.
Thanks very much, Brian. Perhaps I could start by just explaining myself. I'm a trained ecologist and a conservation practitioner with over 20 years experience in the field of wildlife conservation. I have a bachelor's degree in wildlife science and then a master's degree in wildlife management. I briefly worked as a research assistant with the Sudan Wildlife Research Center, and that was way back in the 90s. So after completing my master's, which I did in the UK, I then joined the African Wildlife Foundation. That was 1999, where I worked for 23 years. So while I was with the African Wildlife Foundation, I served in leadership and program management roles at different levels within the organization, executing the organization's mandate, especially within the East African region. So that included developing and supporting program teams at the field level across the different landscapes in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, and then now I have found myself in Somaliland. I think the process of supporting the program teams is what became of great interest to me. I learned a lot about community conservation work and securing space for wildlife outside protected areas, especially in community and private lands, became my main area of focus for close to 20 years. And that's how I developed the interest in community conservation, developed the interest in working with communities to be able to set their land aside for conservation. Hence the idea of the community conservancies.
You've had a very interesting pathway to where you are now, and I'm sure you've seen so much and so much change over the years. Now, you
Yes.
mentioned the you know, the community-based conservation, which we all know is incredibly important. That
Yes.
you know, conservation starts with the people, with the
Yeah.
custodians of the land, because that is the wild. And we
Sure.
hear a lot about conservancies. Can you explain briefly, like, what a conservancy is and why they're important?
It's basically two definitions. So the first one being an area of land set aside by either an individual landowner or a corporate body or a group of landowners or communities for purposes of wildlife conservation or natural resource management. So that's the first definition. And the second definition refers to conservancies as institutions for governance and management of wildlife and other natural resources that are found within a given space. So within the International Union for Conservation of Nature categories of protected areas, conservancy is already considered as a type of protected area. And the IUCN category clearly defines conservancies as a clearly defined geographical space that are recognized, dedicated, and managed through a legal system or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystems and cultural values. And conservancies are extremely important because they provide a very vital role in protecting a large percentage of land where wildlife still exists. Conservancies are also important because they promote healthy ecosystems that support wildlife, livestock, especially for communities that are pastoral in nature, human needs. And conservancies also encourage land uses that are more conducive to conservation. For example, in most of the areas that I have worked in before, whether in Kenya or in Tanzania or in Uganda, and now in Somaliland, livestock and wildlife seem to be able to coexist. The kind of land use between the two seems to align to conservation extremely well. And therefore, the idea of establishing conservancies actually helps in encouraging those kind of land uses. So instead of agriculture and wildlife, livestock and wildlife actually go hand in hand, which is very, very conducive to conservation.
I kind of take from that as well that and please correct me if I'm wrong, that it's almost community empowerment. You know, it's kind of giving them the responsibility, but also
Yes.
in a way ownership as well. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I totally agree with that. And that's why I said one way of defining conservancy is an institution for governance of natural resources. So, and that tends to vary from country to country. It really depends on how the laws of a particular country defines it. So, for example, in Kenya, they define them as institutions, and they work with a combination of the two definitions. And probably in Southern Africa, in countries like Namibia, probably the definition could be different. In Tanzania, it's defined slightly different. So instead of defining them completely as institutions, governance institutions that have been established to manage natural resources, theirs is completely very clear, and it's about wildlife and wildlife utilization, and they call them wildlife management areas. So, and these are areas that initially probably were open areas that were owned by the government, but communities have settled in there. And they also practice a bit of probably hunting and photographic safaris. So it really varies from one country to the other. It depends on how the law defines them, but ultimately, it's all about wildlife, it's all about natural resources, and it's all about people, especially the local communities that live with wildlife.
It's when you look at things from the out, and I'm going by what the questions that I get asked when I'm talking to people. You know, sometimes we use kind of phrases that from the outside looking in, they're not always kind of understood. So when we're talking about the community-based natural resource management, what and I know that it can vary from country to country, region to region. But what type of natural resources could we be talking about?
The type of natural resources we talk about is basically, it can range from wildlife to pasture for grazing, for example. For communities that live around forest reserves or forest blocks, it will be the forest resources. It's about water. It's about salt licks in some specific areas. But basically, it's wildlife, it's forest resources, it's pasture or vegetation for livestock, for example. Those are the kind of natural resources we are talking about, especially in conservancies.
That makes sense, yeah, because again, if you're living on the coastline, then you fish and it can mean so many things to so many different people. But we're talking about the communities, and if we're looking at cheetah conservation, for instance, we know that it's not all about the cheetah, and it's not just about saving the cheetah, it's the ecosystem. But how would you say that the communities, those Conservancy members, if you like, how do they benefit in the longer term?
Well, there are quite a number of benefits that communities are able to get from the Conservancy system. For example, through the Conservancy system, they're able to get increased opportunities, and especially for disadvantaged communities, they are able to engage in the wildlife industry. They're able to engage in natural resource management in areas where there's a good population of wildlife. They can be able to get into business ventures with the private sector. So those are some of the benefits that come to them as communities through the Conservancy system. The Conservancy system is also able to provide an institutional scale that is appropriate for interaction between governments and community structures. So in most cases, you will find that some wildlife authorities or governments would be able, it's faster for them to be able to interact with communities through the Conservancy system, as opposed to getting through the normal regular system. Because the Conservancy system brings the communities together. It's able to make the communities work together. They're able to talk to each other. They're able to listen to one another. So with that, if there is any program that, a conservation-related program that a government institution like the Wildlife Department wants to introduce to the communities, then the Conservancy system becomes the best and the easiest also for them to be able to interact with the community structures. The system also provides communities with a sense of communal decision making, and therefore it makes it a lot easier for them to be able to accelerate their own community projects. So anything that is being done in the name of the communities, for the communities, gives the communities also the opportunity to be able to have a say when it comes to the decision-making process. And the fourth one is that the system is able to make the communities be able to have like a very strong governance structure that they can be able to hold their local leaders accountable, especially in situations where they have ongoing projects that generate some funding or generate some funds for them. So they're able to hold their leaders accountable. They're able to ask for some level of transparency. But for that process to happen, then that means they have to set up a very strong governance structure that they can be able to hold their leaders accountable.
Yeah, when we look at the ecosystem, for want of a better phrase, the position that we're in today. We know that there's changes that are happening or are going to happen, be it environmental changes, climate change, however you want to put it. So is there a working contingency, like for instance, like alternative livelihoods? Is that an integral part of the Conservancy system as well?
Yes, it's definitely very important, and it's also an integral part of the Conservancy system, because one of the key factors that conservation institutions, whether they are organizations, whether they are community-based organizations or international organizations, would always have to provide those alternatives. So it's a kind of a give and take. So you go to communities and tell them, look here, the situation is becoming harder and harder by the day. Climate change is real. Climate change is here to stay with us. So perhaps the kind of livelihoods that you rely on now is not going to be sustainable in the long run. Take, for example, the case of pastoral communities who rely a lot on livestock. Now, with severe droughts, with very prolonged droughts, a lot of them lose their livestock along the way. And therefore, when you start thinking about talking to them about the establishment of conservancies, for example, it's one of the things that they will immediately think about and say, okay, so you want us now to start conservation, you want us to start conserving wildlife. What is this thing that wildlife is going to bring for us as an alternative? And our immediate answer will be yes. You've already seen what you have gone through in terms of loss of your livestock as a result of the long and prolonged drought. You can no longer rely on livestock as your only source of livelihood. We've got to think about something else. So the most important thing is we have to involve them, educate them, and also be able to identify those alternative livelihood options that they will agree to. And it's not really far off from what they are used to. So most pastoral communities, for example, would like to keep a big herd of livestock. But they also know at the same time that when drought comes, it comes in a lot of disasters on their side. So it takes a bit of time to convince them and say, if you set up a conservancy, then you could probably have a private sector partner who can partner with you, establish a tourism facility, then that will generate some revenues for you, and then you can be able to take care of your livelihood and not only rely entirely on livestock, for example. Other nature-based enterprises, other than just tourism, you could think of other non-timber products, for example, very simple things like production of honey, looking at gums and raisins, especially in the arid and semi-arid areas. So all these are options that you can actually provide to the communities through the idea of the Conservancy. And the Conservancy does not really mean that you lock the communities out of what they are used to doing. It's only that you give them the option of also reducing, say, for example, if it's in terms of their livestock numbers, you reduce the livestock numbers so that the livestock number that they have can still be accommodated within the conservation area. And that will mean you have to zone the area, set an area aside for conservation, set an area aside for grazing, for example. And most of the conservancies that I have worked in actually became like the fallback position for pastoral communities, because that's where they would actually take their livestock during the hard times of drought. So it cushions them, especially in terms of pasture during the dry season.
Yeah. So, and when we're talking about, it just kind of, as you were speaking there, so it's great to have this model that you can show examples of other, systems or other conservancies that have tried this and it works, or they've tried this and it doesn't, because we learn as much with failure than we do with success.
Yes.
But it's not just about an alternative. So stop what you're doing now, do this instead. It's also, you know, in the good times, it can almost be, you know, not is supplementary. So it can be in addition to what they've got now.
Yes, sure.
And I know that you and Dr. Laurie Marker and a big team actually took some of the members of the Somaliland government out to Kenya and down to Namibia. Would you say that, you know, can you tell us a little bit about what the Somaliland government and the officials learned? What was their biggest takeaway from seeing them in action?
I think their biggest takeaway from the visit to Kenya is that establishing conservancies is very, very possible. And that's number one. Number two is that it also helps communities to be able to look at conservation, and especially wildlife conservation, positively, because they're able to at least make some income out of conservancies. And then the third one is that when conservancies are established, they are extremely important because they are creating more space for wildlife. One of the key factors, and that's really a reality, especially here in Africa, is that there are no more space left for the establishment of parks and reserves for wildlife. And this is because of increased human population and also human-related factors. Now, one of the things that most African countries have done is, of course, they are party to some of these international conventions, like, for example, Convention of Biological Diversity, and most of them actually committed to the global targets that were set in the 15th Conference of Parties. And that's very important. But the question then they have to keep asking themselves is that, yes, they would like to implement what they call 30 by 30, and that's related to Target 3. And it's all about space. It's all about conserving biodiversity. But where are you going to get the space from? So it's very, very important that they start thinking about conservancies. They start thinking about engaging with communities. And they also start thinking about going beyond protected areas. So yes, governments and authorities have seen, and I think it's a movement that I would say it's expanding now. So it started in Southern Africa and got into East Africa, countries like Tanzania. In Kenya, it has expanded. In Uganda, they are beginning to pick up. And now in Somaliland, they're already beginning to express interest in establishing conservancies. And therefore, it's like a wake-up call to the government of Somaliland. It's like a wake-up call to the leadership that, yes, it can be done. It's already happening, and therefore they need to be part of that initiative.
So when you're looking at, I mean, you've worked with so many different organizations and you continue to do so.
Yes.
And I know this is a very difficult question, and it's you know, and it's very diverse. But what would you say the key components are when you're looking at conservation, for the conservation of biodiversity? You know, what would be, you know, say your top three? What areas would need to be focused on to, you know, to provide that hope for the future?
I'm thinking of really 2 or 3 years key priorities around which the world should be focusing on. One is securing space for conserving biodiversity, and then the second one is addressing issues around climate change. Now, as a continent, Africa is growing, and it's also developing, and it's developing extremely fast. So as I earlier said, Target 3, which is under CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, and referred to as the 30 by 30, cannot be implemented without infringing on the lands of local communities. That's the reality. And therefore, African countries will have to rely on local communities and indigenous people for their land for conservation of biodiversity. Because studies have already proven that, yes, the best conserved areas and the best areas that still hold the highest level of biodiversity is actually on community and indigenous people's lands. So the governments have to take on that initiative. The conservation organizations will have to start working with the local communities to be able to protect what the communities have protected for science, and not taking those land from the communities, but instead support, get into partnership with the communities to be able to conserve those areas for biodiversity. The second point is climate change, and climate change is one of the most pressing global issues of our time, affecting ecosystems, affecting weather patterns, and affecting human livelihoods. So conservation organizations and government authorities or government institutions should also start taking climate change very, very seriously and begin to work and put efforts in making sure that they implement all the measures that are required to reduce the effects of climate change. And the third one is, of course, looking at the issues around livelihoods of communities. The most affected people within the setup are local communities in rural areas, whether it's drought, whether it's floods, all that are associated, whether it's development that is coming up through different government institutions, local communities continue to be affected. And therefore, those are the three priorities around the world that if conservation organizations and wildlife authorities or all authorities have to work on, they really have to focus their energy on those priority areas.
Well, it looks like there's a framework there. There's so much research that has been done. There's so much information that yes, can be shared. And unfortunately, when we look at a lot of the news channels and stuff, you know, they tend to only go for bad news, and it does look very, you know, very depressing. And it's you know, there's no hope and other kind of sound bites like that. You know, what you've seen and what you've done and what you continue to do, would you say that there is positivity, there is hope, and there is a future for the Conservancy of the biodiversity?
Absolutely, yes. If you look at the history of conservation way back, say in the 50s and the 60s, and looking at how protected areas have been established during the colonial times, and it's about 50 years plus, I think things have really, really changed. Governments are beginning to think it's important that they start engaging with communities. Governments are beginning to say, yes, we cannot just be able to rely only on protected areas to provide the space that we need for conservation of biodiversity. Governments are beginning to think, what are some of the innovative ways of communities being able to benefit from natural resources and wildlife? Governments are beginning to say, yes, we need to actually work very closely with our local communities. Benefits that come from wildlife should go to the communities, because it's only the communities who live around, say, for example, protected areas, who live with the brunt of wildlife, especially when it comes to human-wildlife conflict. And one way of being able to support them is by also ensuring that they are able to set up their own conservation areas like conservancies, so that then they can also be able to benefit directly. Resources coming directly from national parks, whether they're in form of conservation fees or they're in form of park entry fees, will not usually be enough. And it's because also the priorities of governments always the top priorities of governments do not normally include conservation of biodiversity. And if there's anything and everything that the governments would do to be able to at least make the communities living around protected areas, I'm sure they will definitely be able to do that. We have already seen, for example, in countries like Tanzania. In Kenya, where I have worked, when we started establishing conservancies, there were just a handful of them. But today, it's about 160, if not 180 conservancies, both privately owned and communally owned. And all that have now established themselves and formed what they call an association that pulls together, and it's a national umbrella body that pulls together all the conservancies within the country. In Tanzania, it's the same thing. You have the consortium of the wildlife management areas that are owned by the communities. In Uganda, for example, you have Umoja Wildlife Conservancies Association. That's also an association of all the conservancies in Uganda. So it's beginning to grow, it's beginning to peak, it's beginning to move, and it's moving faster. And now we are now in Somaliland. And again, the communities are very interested. The government is also very interested in establishing more conservancies. Hopefully they will have a network of conservancies in maybe about 10 or 15 years. And our big dream, especially those of us who are practicing conservation, is to see whether we could have regional bodies of all these conservancies coming together. And then they're able to speak with one voice. They're able to raise their concerns, whether at the continental level or at the global level, but 100% owned and managed by local communities.
I think the successes and the positivity and the results, I think that in itself is empowering, you know, because, you know, if people want to support conservation, sometimes, again, if they watch too much of that news, then it's pointless. You know what I mean? It's pointless. But
yeah,
you know, you've given us examples, and you've proven that these systems work, and there's room for expansion. There's, you know, and you've got kind of buy-in from the authorities, from the decision makers, which I think is great. So Fiesta, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us and telling us a little bit more about the conservancies, because these words are bandied around and accepted without necessarily being understood. So thanks very, very much. Thanks for everything you do. Keep on doing it. We need Fiestas in this world, and hopefully we'll meet up again somewhere in the world.
Absolutely, and thanks very, very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our chat with Fiesta and maybe learned a thing or two about the importance of communities, the local people, the custodians of the land, and the role that they play in the broader aspects of conservation. And don't forget, please subscribe, like, share, and press the notification button to make sure that you don't miss the next episodes of Cheetah TV Conservation Conversations. So thanks very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next time on Cheetah TV.